Welcome back. This video will cover Learning Objective 2.2 for Chapter 2 in PSY 235 Social Psychology. In this learning objective, you're going to be comparing the strengths and weaknesses of different research designs, and these will be broadly defined research designs that social psychologists and scientists in general use. So broadly speaking, because if you took a whole semester course in research design, they would go much more in depth into each one of these. I'm giving you the broad perspective. So scientific methods, broadly speaking, can be categorized into three types. You have some techniques that are observational in nature, and they tend to be used to answer questions that involve classifying, describing, and documenting. There's the correlational method, where you're asking questions about how do variables or phenomena, how do they relate to one another in a predictive fashion. And then there are experimental methods. And here's where you're really wanting to be able to determine cause and effect. So the experimental method is probably based on your K through 12 experiences, what you actually have the most experience in, where you were asked, I know my kids were both, I don't know if any of you had to do this, they were handed a bunch of seeds, and they were instructed to do a simple experiment of spraying some of their little seedlings, their little baby plants, with different levels of vinegar spray. Now, as a gardener, I know vinegar kills plants. So basically we had trays set up in our laundry room with little tiny cups with little marigold sprouts in them, and you had little groups, and you had to spray the plants with different levels of vinegar and determine, does the vinegar harm the plants at different concentrations? And the answer is obviously yes. The whole purpose of the classroom experience was to learn the experimental method. Now, each of these three broad types of scientific methods has advantages and weaknesses. So part of the creativity in being a social psychologist engaged in research is knowing when to choose the right method, use it based on its strengths, but not overstate its ability to, make comment on cause and effect, and, finding ways to minimize weaknesses. Now, in my own approach to research, what I like to try and do is to use more than one method in my program of research. So if I'm initially starting out a new research project, or a research program rather, my first project is usually observational and very qualitative in nature. I want to find out what's out there. So if it's, attitudes about a topic, I may want to just put some things out there, find out what people are thinking. Or I may want to go into documented evidence from archives, look at that. My second kind of tier is to look at correlations, to look at how do variables that are related to my topic of interest, how do they predict one another, and help me understand those kinds of associations. And then I may want to jump to the experimental method and really kind of dig under the hood and find out which of these variables is exerting causal influence and where. So I tend to be a big advocate of multi-method approaches in my research programs. So just to give you a little more information about these three broad categories of methods, observational methods are all about description. What's there, or what's the nature of the phenomenon. Correlation is really about prediction and association. If I know X, can I predict Y? And then experimentation is about causality. If I change X, will it cause a change in Y? Now let's dig into each of these methods. The observational method, the goal is to describe some aspect of human social behavior or social influence. Generally, what we're doing when we use observational techniques is we want to systematically record what we're seeing in human social behaviors. Now, on the surface, you may be thinking, oh, I go out into the wild and I have my little paper and pencil and I write stuff down. Well, that may be one approach to observational techniques, but also there are other ways of doing observation. You can observe by looking at archival records. You can observe by looking at artifacts. You can observe by asking questions of people through interviews, through focus groups, through all kinds of things. If your goal is simply to describe what's there in a phenomenon of interest, then the observational method is what you're doing. So our overarching goal is to describe what a behavior of interest is like, how much of it is happening, how often is it happening, where is it happening, etc. So concrete example, I had a group of students, this is like 20 years ago, they really wanted to know in preschool children what was the level and type of aggressive behaviors that occurred in free play time among toddlers. And they weren't testing any hypotheses. They simply wanted to document aggressive behaviors in this naturalistic environment. So we created kind of a rubric of behaviors that they could look at because they had to operationalize, what do you mean by aggressive behavior? So is it pushy shovey stuff? Is it actual hitting and kicking? Is it biting? Is it saying mean words? So once we had a list of behaviors they were interested in, they had a checklist, and every time they saw the behavior, they checked it off. And at the end of the study, what they were able to show is which kinds of aggressive behaviors were the most common, which kinds were the least common, and so on. Now later, those same researchers wanted to do some quasi-experimental work. They wanted to compare some groups. So I'll come back to this example later in the presentation. One technique, and this is not, I wouldn't say that this is typical of social psychologists, but I have seen some of this work done in my discipline. More often, ethnographies are going to be the work of anthropologists and to some degree sociologists, but those boundaries are far from clear. So there are some psychologists who do ethnographic work. Ethnography involves really kind of immersing yourself in the culture that you're interested in and studying it from the inside out. So a classic example from sociology is, and this is eons ago, a researcher wanted to understand adolescent street gangs. And by long ago, I mean like in the 1960s. And what he did was he made some connections with some of the gang leadership and was able to kind of embed like a reporter in their space to learn what was the hierarchy, what were the norms, what were the expectations. And what he was trying to do was generate a descriptive study that would provide information on which later theories could be based about youth gang culture at that time period. So the goal is to provide a rich, complex description of a particular set of behaviors. Ethnographies tend to be, looking at larger groups, cultures, for example, or subcultures within those cultural groups. This is a primary method used in cultural anthropology, but I have seen some social psychologists engaged in ethnographic research as well. So one of the ethical issues that you really have to be careful about when you're doing ethnographic research is, as a human, you have preconceptions, you have beliefs, you have values, you have assumptions. And you're going to take those with you into the research situation. You're not a robot. You can't turn off your values. You can't turn off your beliefs. You can't turn off your upbringing. If you go into a different culture and there are things that bother you about that culture, you have to really be careful to put it aside. to set it aside. You're there as an observer, not as a change agent. You're not there to try and fix things. So, for example, let's say that you're going into a culture where the assumptions and beliefs and values are very different from your own culture. And you feel like people are being harmed because of those differences. Maybe some kids aren't allowed to go to school because of their caste, because of their social grouping. They're treated very badly. They're with high degrees of discrimination. As the anthropologist or as the social psychologist doing the research, your job is to observe and report, not to intervene. There's also an important kind of rule of ethnographic and observational research in general. It's important to have more than one observer. Those biases that I was just talking about, those are hard to suppress. And the ethical issues are many when we find ourselves in difficult social situations where we feel like people may be in danger. So those are hard calls to make. Having multiple observers helps us, number one, to stay objective, but it also can give us the context by bouncing our perceptions off of another person, it can help ground us in more objectivity. A bit more common among social psychologists is doing archival research. And this is also pretty common in sociology. It's also common in criminal justice research as well, if some of you are studying in that area. We often go into documents, records, and other kinds of artifacts in order to ask and answer questions about phenomena of interest. So your authors list a whole bunch of different kind of archival data that you can tap into. For my students, we've tended not to do too many archival projects, but the ones that have been done involved examining records. Many years ago, I had a group of students who were simultaneously doing their senior research project. They had also been volunteers at a domestic violence shelter, and they wanted to do some documentation by looking just through the records for the last decade of people who came into the domestic violence shelter in Alliance, and look at how many of them had to leave behind their pets, because they were kind of thinking, isn't that a problem? Isn't that one of the barriers to going into a shelter when you're experiencing domestic abuse? And they had a bunch of other questions as well that they wanted to document. How often was this thing happening? So they went through the records, and that was one of the intake questions, was about pets in the home. And they were able to show that there was a significant kind of pattern of the abuse of pets. In some cases on intake, people were reporting that their abuser had actually killed a family pet. And that was one of the things that was, triggering for them to move into going into a shelter. So, in addition to this list here, you can also get permissions to look at criminal justice records, like jail records and things like that, as long as they are anonymized, so that you can look at patterns of behavior in that context. Now, there are lots of limitations to the observational method. Your authors spend a lot of time talking about the Latané and Darley approaches to studying helping behavior in out in the wild, out in the real world. So I'm not going to repeat that here, but there are limitations. Some kinds of behaviors are really hard to observe. Early researchers studying human sexual behavior ran headlong into that problem. People are private about their sex lives, so you can't really just sort of hang out and watch. Unless it's in very specific kind of context. There are actually loads of observational studies of the behavior of people in strip clubs, for example. But everyday life, there are lots of behaviors that are hard to observe simply because they tend to occur in private spaces. So let's say you are interested in domestic violence. The home is a private space. So it's very hard for us to do that kind of observational work in those settings. With archival studies, you're limited by the archival materials that you have available to you. You don't have an ability to randomly sample information from the culture at that time. So the original writers of archival materials, you're really kind of handcuffed by the information that they give you. It may not be all the information that people would later need. You may have a bunch of archival records that are only written by one segment of the population, for instance, by those who are educated and who can read and write. What about the people who can't or couldn't read and write at the time those other documents were found? So only being able to look at the documents that you have access to may mean that there is some inherent bias in what you're seeing. So you have to be careful about that. Now, generally, as I said earlier, a lot of researchers will start with observation and kind of document the strength of a phenomenon in the culture or in whatever the location is that they're studying. And then they want to do more. So the next step or the next type of methodology is a correlational method. Now, I kind of wish that instead of using the word correlational in this context, we would use associative instead, because students often get kind of tangled up in the difference between the statistic, the correlation coefficient, and the method, which is using the word correlational in a much more broad sense. Before we launch into, really kind of what the correlational method or the associative method really is, just a reminder, and I'll say this probably 100 times across the course of the semester, correlation should not be interpreted as causal. You can say things about correlations like, your high school GPA is in fact predictive of your first semester GPA in college. It's not as strong a predictor of your GPA at the end of college. Fun fact. Does your performance in high school cause your performance in college? No. And that sounds silly to even say it. But as this Calvin and Hobbes comic strip kind of points out, there's always conversation about graphic violence in the media. Does it glamorize? Does it cause problems? Does it cause violence? And as the writer of the comic strip says, well, that's hard to prove. The trick is to ask the right question. And while this is meant to be funny, it's actually dead right. You can show that there's a correlation between exposure to media violence and actual violent behavior. It is a correlation. We know that they predict each other. Media consumption in general tends to be associated with aggressiveness, but it's associated. The cause part has to be tested using an actual experiment. So let's dig into the correlational method. The strict kind of definition of a correlational method being applied is where you're taking two or more variables and then you're going to systematically measure them. So, for example, going back to Calvin and Hobbes, if I need to measure how much media is being consumed and how much of that media involves violence and aggressiveness. So I can measure that. I can also measure using, say, parent reports, if we're talking about kids, of a child's behavior. Get those parent reports, how much of which kinds of aggressive behavior are being exhibited. And then I can test, does the amount of media consumed predict how much aggressive behavior is going to be exhibited? And vice versa. With the aggressive behavior, how well does that predict how much media is consumed? So essentially the question you're asking is, how well can I predict one variable using another, and vice versa? In the lingo of correlation, you have two basic kinds of correlations, either a positive correlation or a negative correlation. In the example of media consumption and violent behavior, what we tend to find in the research literature is a positive correlation. So we tend to find that as the amount of media consumption goes up, the amount of aggressive behavior also tends to go up. And it's reciprocal. As the amount of aggressive behavior goes up, so does the amount of media consumed. Now, other kinds of relationships between variables may be what's called negative. And the word negative doesn't mean bad. It just means that as one thing goes up, the other thing goes down. So, for example, the relationship between self-esteem and symptoms of depression. As self-esteem scores go higher, depression scores on an assessment tend to go lower. That's a negative or inverse correlation. Now, I mentioned that sometimes I wish that they wouldn't call it a correlational method because it's confusing. It confuses students when they think about the math, the statistical technique called the correlation coefficient. Not all quote-unquote correlational designs involve running a correlation test. You may actually be doing other kinds of tests in your associative to test your associative hypotheses, but we'll come back to that in a little bit. So your authors provide you with this graphic that I've seen 100,000 different versions of, just showing you kind of in image form the difference between a positive correlation, which would be this image, a negative correlation, which would be this image, and then no correlation. And here the example they're using is about media. Amount of media watched, aggression as documented by observation. And this version is, I wouldn't say it would be as strong a correlation as this, but we tend to see a positive correlation between those variables. We tend not to see this, that as the amount of television watched goes up, aggression goes down. We tend not to see that in the real data. In some studies, we find no relationship. So if you have our little dots on a scatter plot, each of these points is a person, and it's the co-occurrence of their scores. So you have their score on television watched goes to that dot, and their score on aggressiveness is over here. So it's a scatter plot. And I know my kids learned scatter plots in, I think, middle school. And I was like, God, why are they teaching you a scatter plot? But, there you go. So these are visual depictions of the different types of correlation coefficients that you can get. The math of it, the correlation coefficient, it's represented by the small k, lowercase letter r. The value runs from plus or minus 1 to 0. So a correlation can go from -1 to +1. The plus and minus signs refer to the direction of the relationship. So a perfect correlation of +1 would be represented by that red line going through the first image on your screen. It would be a perfect 1-to-1 relationship. A perfect negative relationship would be the red line on the right-hand side of your screen. Now, the smaller the number, the closer the number, regardless of the sign, the closer the number gets to 0, the weaker the relationship. So 1, whether it's positive or negative, is the strongest value you can get. It's a perfect relationship. A positive 1 means that there you have a perfect correlation in a positive direction. 0 means that the variables are not related at all, meaning you can't predict the value of one variable using the other. A negative 1 means you have a perfect negative relationship. Now, in reality, we don't get perfect correlations. You'll see social scientists jump for happy joy if they get correlations of 0.5, because humans are messy. You're never going to perfectly explain any behavior, let alone a complex human behavior like aggression, using just one variable. So with TV or any kind of media consumption, the fact of the matter is you're typically going to get correlations there in the 2s, the 0.2s, which are solid, but what it says is media consumption explains a very small proportion of the variability in human aggressive behavior. Other factors are in play. And that's one of the most important things to understand about correlational and associative techniques. You're only going to explain the variability in a social behavior like aggression if you include lots of different variables. The trick is to figure out how all those variables are interrelated, and then eventually to do experimental research to help you tease out the cause and effect patterns. Now, one approach to testing associative hypotheses is to conduct surveys. And in survey research, what we try to do is to pull samples of the population we're interested in and then ask them questions about their attitudes and actions. Many survey studies are designed to test associative or correlational hypotheses. So how are these variables related? Like lots of surveys asking you about consumer products that you like or don't like, or your intentions about buying. And a lot of that involves testing correlational hypotheses. If you want your results to be generalizable to a large population, there are lots of rules about how do you get a generalizable sample. Ideally, what we want to do is randomly select people to respond to our surveys from the population at large. Easier said than done. As a survey researcher, I can tell you that. It's very, very hard to get random samples that are really representative of the populations that we're interested in. Now, sometimes you can pull it off, but it is tricky. It's hard to do. Why is random selection the goal? It's one of the only ways we have of ensuring that a small group of people is representative of a larger population, so that we can make conclusions about how predictive models, how strong they are, how robust they are in helping us understand behaviors that we're interested in. So when we think about survey research, there's lots of advantages. The primary advantage is they're easy to do, especially now that we can conduct them online. And that kind of saves a lot of steps for the researcher. You can get a lot of data in a short amount of time. If you're able to get those representative samples, it can be a very powerful descriptive tool for helping you describe those associations between variables. It is difficult, though. You have to remind yourself of the disadvantages. Sometimes people outright lie with their responses. Like if you're asking them about drug and alcohol consumption, some people intentionally minimize how much they're doing or just deny that they're doing it at all. Sometimes they overstate. There are other ways in which people just are simply wrong. Human beings are remarkably inept at time, knowing how often they do something over the course of even a week. People are astounding in the inaccuracy of their statements. So we have to be really cognizant of that, aware that people are not good at estimating time. They're not good at avoiding kind of massaging their own memories. So if I asked you right now, take me back to your birthday when you were 7, your brain would start a trip down that pathway and think, okay, birthdays. birthdays. I would have been in like what, second grade? And then your brain is totally engaged in the idea of reconstructing a memory of that event. What you come up with may or may not have any connection to what actually happened, but it would probably be an average representation of your childhood birthdays. So there are lots of times when we can't rely on people's memories to represent what they have actually experienced. So we have to be very crafty, very careful in building our surveys so that we can get people to answer questions they can actually answer reliably. So what are the limitations of the correlational method? Forgive my meme usage here. Remind yourself on a constant basis, correlation does not prove causation. It simply does not prove causation. I do wish every time a reporter was reporting on a piece of science and the science was inherently correlational and they kind of trotted out there as causal, it just makes me want to throat punch people. So anyway, remind yourself that correlation does not equal causation. The major shortcomings of the associative method is it really can only tell you, can I predict this variable using that variable? Other than that, it can't do a whole lot. So rich descriptions of how you have interrelationships among variables, very important. I would argue that the majority of research that's out there in social psychology is correlational in nature. So over the course of this semester, you're going to hear me say often, this is what was found, but it's correlational. So in order to test whether or not there's a causal relationship, we would have to go into using an experimental method. So eventually, though, we want those cause and effect relationships. So we'll need to move into the experimental techniques. And what you'll learn when we start to dig into the experimental method is there are some reasons why most of our research is correlational in nature. Now, we want to be able to say that, A causes B. We don't just want to be able to be limited to saying A is correlated with B. The trick, though, many human social behaviors cannot be directly studied in the laboratory. So, for example, if you're really interested in this correlation between variables, early studies, and this is an image capture of a first-person shooter game from an older game. If you want to know, does the consumption of media, like aggressive video games, first-person shooter games, for example, is that usage correlated with aggressive behavior? And this analysis will show you the limitations. One possible outcome, maybe there is a causal connection. Maybe watching TV violence or watching media violence, playing violent video games, maybe it does cause viewers to become more violent. That's one possible outcome. Maybe kids who are already violent or people who are already violent are attracted to violent video games or violence in TV. Maybe both are caused by something else. So any of those outcomes is possible. If you get that correlation, so you run your Pearson R correlation statistic and you find that there's a positive correlation between consumption of media violence or, say, playing violent video games and actual aggressive behavior, you have to interpret that. Any of these three interpretations is equally valid. So how do you find out which it is? So what is really behind that correlation? What you need is to do an experiment. So here's an example, and this is an older study. So I like the video simply because it's a very clean, clear example of using an experimental technique.
In the experimental study, the main independent variable again was violent video gameplay. What we did was was we had two separate video games. One was very violent in nature and graphic, and the other was non-violent in nature. So those were the two levels of the independent variable. The dependent variables were aggressive behavior, aggressive thoughts, and aggressive emotions.
The independent variable in the experimental study was expected to be related to the dependent variable in the following way. We expected those who had been randomly assigned to play the violent game would later on behave more aggressively than those who had been assigned to play the nonviolent game.
In order to find out if the independent variable causes a change in a dependent variable, scientists established two different groups of subjects. In the first, the experimental group, they manipulate the independent variable to see what effect it has on the dependent variable. In the second group, the control group, there is no such manipulation.
The reason we use a control group is because always when you have an independent variable, you have to have at least two groups within that independent variable. For example, the experimental group and the control group. Let's say, for example, I was studying violent video game effects, and all I did was take some students, have them play a violent video game, and then measure their aggression. Well, then I would say, hey, these students had a certain level of aggression, but the question would be, are they aggressive or not? Compared to what? And so I have to have something to compare them to. And the role of the control group is to act like a baseline.
And for that reason, we want the control group to be essentially the same as the experimental group in all features, as many as possible, with the exception of the independent variable. As we want them to be the same kind of people, we want them to be treated the same way by the experimenters. We want them to play a game that is as equally enjoyable or frustrating. We simply want the groups to differ on one thing, and that one thing in this case is, does the game contain violent content or not?
One way the researchers achieve this sameness between groups is through random assignment of the subjects.
In order to show cause and effect relationships, one needs to assume that the groups in a study, the participants in a study, initially began as equal or nearly equivalent. The best way to ensure that is to use some kind of a scheme where individuals who have agreed to participate in a study are assigned to an experimental or control group based on chance. In this way, the characteristics of individuals that differ naturally in the world, that these characteristics could somehow be evened out across experimental and control groups initially.
What we do is randomly assign participants to either the control group or the experimental group, and random assignment means that each student had an equal chance of being in one of those two groups.
Random assignment is essential to valid results. For instance, if Anderson and Dill had allowed the players to pick which game to play instead of assigning them to games, the more aggressive players might have chosen the more aggressive game. It would have been impossible to determine if any later aggressive behavior was due to the game or to just their personality. Likewise, it's important to ensure that other variables cannot have caused the results.
The control group differed from the experimental group only in the content of the game that they played. In all other respects, they were treated the same. They were the same kinds of people. We had males and females in both groups. We had high and low trait aggressive people in both groups. The way that the experimenter treated them in terms of instructions, how long they played the game, all those sorts of things were essentially identical.
We try to make the environment for those participants as similar as possible, except for the independent variable of video game violence. So the students came into the same laboratory. It was the same room, same temperature, same surroundings. They sat in the same sized cubicle. They had the same experimenter. And time of day was a random factor such that students came all during the day at different times, and that was not tied to whether they were in the experimental or the control group.
Furthermore, the two games themselves were selected to be similar in a lot of ways. Both are called first-person games. They were equated in terms of how much our participant population enjoyed playing them on average. They were equated in terms of how much physiological arousal they induce in people when they play them. So the two conditions really differed primarily in terms of that violent content, that is, the independent variable itself.
Once the subjects had played the game, the researchers next measured their aggressiveness.
We use a standard laboratory measure of aggressive behavior. It's called the competitive reaction time task. It's been used, or various versions of it have been used for well over 35 years now. In this task, the participant believes that they're competing against another person who's in another room, sitting at another computer, on a series of reaction time trials. They put headphones on, they hear a tone, they click a mouse button. Whoever responds slowest is punished by a blast of noise, called white noise, static essentially, over the headphones. Now, in reality, there is no other person. It's all computer controlled.
We analyze the data using a statistical technique called analysis of variance. And what that looks at is it tries to find group differences. So in our case, was there a difference in the amount of aggressive behavior between those who'd played the violent video game and those who'd played the non-violent video game? And our analysis of variance confirmed that this was the case. The results of the study indicated confirmation of our first two hypotheses, but not the last one. In other words, we found that playing violent video games in the laboratory caused increases in aggressive behavior and aggressive thoughts, but not for our third hypothesis, which was increases in aggressive emotions.
This study also showed that this short-term exposure to violent video game increases aggressive thoughts, one of our other dependent variables. And that was pretty much as expected by the theory. We also found that people who score high on measures of trait aggression do, in fact, behave more aggressively than those who score low.
So that's a concrete example of a reasonably straightforward experimental design. It's a nice, tidy design. Some would describe it in the scientific world as being elegant because you have a relatively small number of dependent measures, one experimental, one independent measure that you're manipulating, and it's very carefully designed. So the only way that researchers can determine causality is to use an experimental design like the example that you were just provided. What you're going to do as the researcher is to randomly assign your participants to different conditions and assure that those conditions are identical except for the independent variable. So you had, in the example, you had some participants in the first-person shooter game with violent content, some people in the first-person game without violent content, and they were then measured on 3 dependent variables of interest. So let's look at these independent and dependent variables a little more. I know that when my kids were in their grade school and middle school science classes, they talked about the independent variable as something manipulated. That's one way of looking at it. The independent variable is the presumed causal variable. It's the variable that you think has some sort of influence over other variables. And that's why those other variables are called dependent. So they're dependent on the level of the independent variable. So the example that they follow in your text is, if you systematically vary the number of people who are present during an emergency, that would be the independent variable. The dependent variable is how likely are people to give help in that emergency situation, and another variable would be how long does it take them to do so. And the assumption is that whether or not you help and how fast you help is dependent on how many people are in the room during the emergency. That's the independent variable. So you could talk about and I do this with my students sometimes, I refer to the independent variable as the causal variable and the dependent variables as outcome variables. So if I change my causal variable, my independent variable, what is the impact on the outcome variable? One of the things that makes the experimental method so powerful is the fact that it ensures a high degree of what's called internal validity. Internal validity refers to that holding constant that they were mentioning so often in the video. Everything other than the dependent or the independent variable is going to be held constant. So the participants are going to have the same kind of gaming environment, the same room. Any variations in time of day are going to be random. They're going to have the same instructions from the experimenters. The games were chosen so that they were equal in level of enjoyment. All of those things are going to be held constant. And then you randomly assign people to groups to ensure that characteristics, personality attributes, experience variables, that they're going to be equally spread out across all of the conditions of your experiment. So what we often call this is experimental control. Internal validity is high to the degree that you've exerted a great deal of experimental control. On the other side of the coin is what's called external validity. External validity refers to the degree to which you can take your findings and generalize them to the real world, to other kinds of situations. Like, can I take this finding from the laboratory, that laboratory study of the video games, can I take that finding and put it in the real world? So, quick specific issue for that study, the type of aggressive behavior they measured was very artificial. So I don't know about you, but I don't walk around in my everyday life with a device in my pocket that can deliver white noise to people who annoy me. I may like that. That might be entertaining, but I do not have that capacity. So, although I do have an ultrasonic emitter that I can use on my dogs to get them to stop barking, but I can't do that with people. And that's exactly what the measure of aggressive behavior is in the study that you watch the video on. It's delivering white noise through headphones. So the question becomes, can I generalize the findings across a variety of situations? If you have a highly constructed experimental situation, can I take it out into the real world? Now, Latané and Darley, in their research on helping behavior, they did a lot of the work in the lab first, under tightly controlled situations where they had a high degree of internal validity. Then they went out into the real world. They took their paradigm and they got on subways and staged fake emergencies. They went out on the street and staged fake emergencies. All kinds of stuff like that to see if their hypotheses held when you have a messier social context and have less control over those variables that float around in the atmosphere. You also want your findings to generalize across different kinds of people as well. So, to the degree you can get a solid random sample of the people who are available to you, like the study that was in the video, those were college student participants. Well, what about other kinds of people? Maybe the findings won't hold up if I test people who are significantly older, people from different walks of life, people of different ages, people of different backgrounds. Will it hold up with all those different kinds of people? So, to go back to the Latané and Darley kind of example, they did some research cross-culturally, but other researchers took the paradigm and tested it cross-culturally and found very similar results, although there were some cross-cultural differences. And that's why that kind of research needs to be done. So the limitations of the experimental method are primarily in the fact that they tend to be fairly artificial. So they're really in this this rarefied environment where you're controlling every other variable, so everything else is held constant except for the independent variable you're interested in. So our real life world isn't like that, especially if you're studying tricky behaviors like aggression, where ethically you can't put people in a laboratory and let them beat the crap out of each other. It's just not right. It's illegal. So we have to do something artificial, like being willing to push a button to deliver white noise to a competitor in a game. We can call that aggression, but is it really the same as getting into a fist fight with your neighbor? No, it's not. So one of the problems with experimental techniques is that they do tend to be artificial. Field experiments, like the ones that Latané and Darley did in their studies of helping behavior, taking their bag of tricks that they had tested experimentally in the lab and then going out into the real environment to see if those hypotheses hold. And in fact, for the most part, they did. So where there's always this trade-off. Everything that you do to increase internal validity is going to reduce external validity. Everything you do to increase external validity is going to decrease internal validity. Now, resolving that is always a challenge, and this is why we don't just do single projects. We do programs of research with multiple studies that we do over time. One of the ways that we increase external validity is by doing field experiments. Like I was describing, Latané and Darley did. They took their methodology, adapted it for use in the field. So what you're adding is naturalistic settings, and you're testing your assumptions. It can still be pretty difficult, though, to achieve anything near the level of internal validity that you have in a laboratory in the field. For some behaviors, doing field studies is completely impossible. And for some behaviors, you can't even do the experimental work. So you're really limited to just looking at correlational data. And that kind of leads us to the basic dilemma of the social psychologist, where this trade-off between internal and external validity really forces us to make some hard decisions about how to do research. Sacrificing external validity in exchange for internal validity is something we often do as part of a research program. It's like testing proof of concept. So you start out with the laboratory study and show there's an effect here that we can pursue. Then you go out into the field and see if it holds. So you're increasing external validity afterwards, and you are losing some control over the setting. But over time, when you conduct those high internal validity experiments early, and then you modify your approach and you take it out into the field, you're really showing the robustness of an effect. So we often begin by maximizing internal validity, establishing what those basic cause and effect patterns are under the most controlled conditions. Then we start testing with different populations, different settings, different field experiences, and so on. So how do we deal with this basic dilemma? There are a number of ways. Field experiments are one of them, but replication is key. You need to replicate your studies in various settings with different populations to test for generalizability. Anytime we do replications, there are always going to be subtle differences and changes. Sometimes replications do not confirm our previous findings, and that means you need to go back to the drawing board and really, repeat your earlier research, find what the critical variables were, and then keep pursuing it until you have some better data to work with. There's also a technique called a meta-analysis, where you can pull together results from multiple studies at the same time to get a sense of the effect of the independent variable across multiple studies. There are a couple broad categories of research, in addition to types of methodologies, you also have the difference between basic and applied research. Basic research refers to research that's done for pure scientific curiosity, saying, I wonder what the answer to this question is because I care about these things. So, when I became interested in the experiences of foster dog providers, it was purely out of intellectual curiosity that I wanted to study, caregiver burnout in the context of fostering dogs in rescues. At the same time, though, I could retool that question and make it applied. So in the applied research area, you're really trying to solve practical problems. In my foster dog research, there's also an applied element to it. I supplied the data back to my rescue and said, how can this help you to meet the needs of your volunteers so that they don't quit? Right? So basic research, the researcher just wants to answer the question and apply it to theory, advance the theory, whatever. Research in social psychology is often applied, though. Many social psychologists are really invested in figuring out the answers to critical problems like human aggression, prejudice, and so on. In the next video, we'll be looking at cross-cultural research and the advent of social neuroscience as additional ways of approaching the questions of human social behavior.